Hi everyone. This week we're moving into a new unit, the logistics of injury prevention and logistics of prevention in general. And this week we are focusing on the nuts and bolts of prevention. Now, last week and the two subsequent weeks, we have really focused on prioritizing our prevention and understanding which stakeholders are there that we need to consult, and then finally, which theories of change do we want to utilize in order to implement our prevention program. Now we're really getting into the implementation part. So if you think about the prioritizing your prevention priorities, the identification of your stakeholders and trying to figure out why they're important so you can get them on board. Getting them on board is going to be critical. And you have at least a theoretical framework of what drives people to do injury prevention programming, in addition to some of the stuff we talked about early on in terms of risk factor analysis. That was in your prioritization process, or it should be in your prioritization process, in terms of what risk factors are existent for the specific injuries you're looking for. Right? After you've done all that, now it's time to select or create your injury prevention program. Now, here's the challenge. Here is the problem with injury prevention practices. And this is not going to be the answer that many of you want, because one specific question and one specific request you had for me this semester was specific injury prevention programs. Now, there are a ton of sports injury prevention programs out there for every part of the body. There are 10 for the ankle, 20 for the knee, however many for the entire lower extremity. You got upper extremity prevention programs. You got things as simple as the thrower's 10, which we don't technically think of as a prevention program. We think of it as a maintenance program. But in reality, that maintenance program is actually a prevention program. So there are all these practices that we have that have been studied, right? But the problem with those studies is that they created them, and they created them for a very, very, very narrow population. Women collegiate basketball players, Division I. The actual number of people who that was studied on was a small portion of NCAA Division I women basketball players. That's it. There is no evidence that this works in NCAA Division I men's basketball players, or women basketball players in the professional ranks, or women basketball players in Division II, Division III, NAIA, JUCO, high school, youth, recreational. There is no evidence to support the use of that in any other population besides what it's studied. The Peak C is another one. That's an ACL injury prevention program. It, fortunately, has been studied on a couple populations, but those populations are narrow. Men's and women's basketball players, men's soccer players, collegiate only, Division I only. And then also United States Military Academy, so people who are not in the military yet, they are still going through school to become military officers. Those individuals. Those are the only people it's been tested on. So you see where the problem comes in. Only one person in this program, or couple people in this program, can actually use the well-studied injury prevention programs. That's it. What about the rest of you? What about all of you working in a secondary school? What about all you not working in the NCAA Division I? And we could even stratify that a little bit more. The big time, like Power 5 NCAA Division I. Well, let's be honest. Let's just cut to the chase. ACC women's basketball players. Big East women's basketball players. Haven't done studies on Big Ten basketball players. Haven't done studies on SEC basketball players. God forbid I know we haven't done anything in the far West with the Pac-12. That's just the way it is. Because that's where the injury, that's where the studies are being conducted. They're being conducted in ACC schools, and that's it. So the transferability of those studies has not been examined. So I don't have like hard and fast rules. And I think it's disappointing. And it's disappointing for athletic trainers, and I think you can feel the frustration of athletic trainers when we see this. Like when you go out, when you go to convention, if you ever go to one of these talks that talk about injury prevention programming, you're going to hear the researchers up there and say, well, limitations of this study is they're not generalizable to the larger athletic population. And so you have a secondary school athletic trainer that spent an hour at that program. Or you have a Division II athletic trainer spend an hour at that program, and they're asking themselves, you just told me there's a great program that seems to be really fantastic, but you're telling me you can't say anything about how this would work in non-elite level athletes enrolled in a program that also has a culture that is focused on injury prevention. If you took one of these programs and simply plugged it into your clinical practice, but you didn't have a culture of injury prevention practices with your coaching staff, with your administration, with your players, it would probably fail miserably. And you know what? That injury prevention program would have very different results simply because of the culture that is created at those institutions, because there is such a strong relationship between the research practitioners, the athletic trainers, the coaches, the administration of the university and of athletics, that creates this culture of injury prevention practices. It creates this culture of compliance. It creates this culture of reporting when things aren't going right or reporting when things are going well. It represents a culture of acceptance. Most places don't have that. In fact, one of your readings this week was done by Mark Norcross out at Oregon State, and he looked at secondary school coaches. Only 10% of secondary school coaches said that they would be in favor of implementing an injury prevention program, even if they didn't have to do anything. Only 10% of secondary school boys basketball coaches said that they would be in favor of implementing one of these things, even if they told them that it would decrease the number of injuries that they had. And there is the problem. I can't give you specifics on this injury prevention program is going to work for everyone. This injury prevention is going to work for you. But what I can tell you is that as doctorate and athletic training students, as PhD students, you all have the skills to start to utilize a base plan and then tweak it based off of your own practice-based research and based off of your culture. I think when we look at injury prevention programs in general, athletic trainers specifically and coaches tend to take these injury prevention programs literal. And if you don't follow them to a T, the effectiveness is going to be off. Well, sorry, the effectiveness is going to be off because you're not using it on the same population. So throw that excuse out the door. And I think the other part that's kind of funny with this whole thing is you hear evidence-based practice in athletic training, and you hear all these people saying, we need to incorporate patient values, we need to incorporate clinical expertise. But when it comes to injury prevention programs, somehow athletic trainers think that they have no knowledge on how to do that, so they must take the verbatim form of the injury prevention program from the research article that they found in the Journal of Athletic Training they don't understand half the words of, and then implement it exactly how it is, without any consideration for culture differences, for their skill, for their clinical expertise, and their clinical experience. We don't do it in any other aspect of our patient care. But for whatever reason, there is resistance and there's a feeling that we must apply injury prevention programs verbatim from the research article. And if we don't, we're somehow messing up the effectiveness. As we approach injury prevention, we should approach injury prevention the same way as we approach everything else, an evidence-based triangle, where we take the literature, we take our clinical expertise, and we take our patient values, and we incorporate them to provide the best care for our patients, not what the study said to do. And so you're not gonna hear from me, here's a program to do. What you're gonna hear and what we're gonna talk about this week, and what I really want you guys to get out of your activities this week, is using your brain, using your clinical expertise, using your patient values, using your prioritization process and understanding the prioritizations of your risk factors that you've done the past 3 weeks, and understanding the injury surveillance data that you created the last 3 weeks, the last 4 weeks, understanding that plan, and also understanding your stakeholders, particularly your patients and patient values, and then using those pieces to create a plan that works for you. That's what injury prevention is all about. Creating a plan that works for you and measuring what you do and to make changes over time. The other problem with the research that's out there right now is that no one is measuring what they do in practice. The only data we have is from researcher-driven work. We have no clinician-driven work on if these programs actually work. And also, when you have two programs, you got the Peak C and the FIFA 11 Plus. One's an elite women's basketball player, or one's an elite athletes, the other one's in UEFA soccer players, and you compare the two. We have no studies that compare the two. We have no comparative effectiveness methodologies currently used in athletic training research and injury prevention research in general, not just athletic training, and not just in sports injury, musculoskeletal injury prevention, we don't have a lot of comparative effectiveness studies, which is hindering us, because as an athletic trainer, you're reading, do I listen to this thing from UEFA, or do I listen to this thing from UNC Chapel Hill, or do I listen to this thing from Pittsburgh, or do I listen to this thing from Missouri, or do I listen to this thing from Dr. Andrews that he just made up on his own? That's not really been studied at all, but he says it's good, and I heard Dr. Andrews on the news one day. Right? So I know this is starting to sound like a rant, but it's not. It's a call to you guys, to you all, to reframe your approach to prevention, to reframe your approach to sports injury prevention from I must use this to here's a framework for which I can use and tweak based off of my specific clinical practice. But I must measure that. And I must track changes that I make. I must be responsive to the needs of my patients. I must be responsive to the information my clinical expertise is telling me. And I must be responsive to the new work that's constantly coming out as relates to injury prevention programming. So we have this, you've got all this, you've done your list of things, right? You understand your data, you've talked to your stakeholders, you understand the risk factors. Some of you in your assignment the other week just said examination of risk factors. Well, whoop-de-doo. You got to go and tell me what the risk factors for injury are. So when you guys are determining this and you're discussing these things, you got to get into the literature and understanding what the risk factors are. The risk factors for a lateral ankle sprain are different from the risk factors of a medial ankle sprain. Is different than the risk factors for an MCL sprain. Is different than the risk factors of an ACL sprain. Is different for the risk factors of a hamstring strain. So the risk factor analysis is so important. And for those of you that didn't hammer that home in the last assignment or the last couple assignments, when we get to this point, we're talking about it, you're like, well, I don't know what to pick. Well, Part of that is you're going to have to go back and do more work on risk factor analysis in terms of what things can actually be changed. You can't change the sex of an individual from a hormonal perspective. You can't change the biomechanical and anatomical, the biomechanical changes that occur because of anatomy. You can't change that. You can't change the Q angle of an individual. You can't change the hip width. You can't change the flatness of their feet. You can change the external or the modified. You can change the external factors such as landing mechanics, such as strength, such as proprioception, such as balance. You can change those things, but you got to work within what you have. So you have all that information. Now it's time to build your injury prevention program for whatever injury, whatever area that you want. In order to do this, you have to have some evidence, you got to know your patient values, you got to have some clinical expertise. When you're building this, it's going to be important to commit to the community and to commit to a specific plan. Because injury prevention programs take time to work. I think maybe one of the reasons coaches, secondary school coaches, are against this is because it takes time to work. It's not like day one start injury prevention program and someone's not going to have an ankle sprain. It's still going to happen. It doesn't work that way. Also, just because you do an injury prevention program does not mean ankle sprains won't happen. There is inherent risk that cannot be eliminated for injuries in sports. You have people moving at high velocities. Most of them have big mass, more massive than other things, right? So we have to have those conversations with our stakeholders that I'm going to prevent an injury. I want to implement an injury prevention program, coach. I think it would really benefit the athletes. Coach says, how many injuries is this going to be able to prevent? I don't know. It may not prevent any. It may prevent 20, may prevent 100. But you know what? If you do it or you don't do it, you never know how many actual injuries you prevented. Because you can't run a randomized control trial in your clinical practice where half the team gets it and half the team doesn't. Even if you did, you're dealing with such a small sample size, you're not going to be able to make any decisions off of that. So a lot of this is guesswork, and a lot of this is trust, and a lot of this is stakeholder buy-in, and a lot of this is creating a culture of injury prevention. It's not about the program. It is about the program, but it's not about the program. Right? The reason injury prevention programs are successful is not the special parts of the program. It's the fact that they are spending dedicated practice time and committed practice time to improving neuromuscular control, to improving strength, to improving flexibility, to improving joint range of motion, to improving landing mechanics. That's what it is. Is there something special about the order of the activities that the FIFA 11 Plus does? Is there something special about the activities that the Peak C do that we don't already know or that can't be achieved in a different way? No. The difference is those individuals and those communities and those stakeholders have bought into the program. As an athletic trainer, we do these things on a micro level. We do injury prevention on a micro level during rehabilitation. The same rehabilitation exercises that we're doing, at least if they're functional and on your feet, are the same types of goals that we have for injury prevention programs. If you go back to your professional education, you think about what are the goals of rehabilitation, like what are the parts of rehabilitation, right? We have psychosocial component, goal setting. Psychosocial component is really important part of injury prevention programs. You have to believe that it's working. You have to have goals to meet. You have to have standards to meet. Range of motion, flexibility. Needs to be a goal for injury prevention too. Muscular strength and endurance. Cardiorespiratory fitness. Power. Plyometrics. Balance and neuromuscular control. Proprioception. I'm sure I'm missing one. Agility. All of those things that we work on in rehabilitation are also the same things that we need to work on in injury prevention. But in order to do that effectively, we have to have buy-in. We have to have a community that accepts this. And I think if we as athletic trainers viewed injury prevention the same way we view and we approach rehabilitation, just at a macro level, we would be much more successful in selling ourselves. We would be much more successful in actually preventing injuries. Because most athletic trainers are relatively comfortable. They may say, I'm not the best at this, but I'm relatively comfortable with rehabilitation. I need to improve my back rehabilitation, or they're going to say something like that, right? Or my neck rehabilitation. But you ask them lower extremity, upper extremity, they're going to be pretty okay with that. They know they're going to have to incorporate the core somehow, just like you would have with an injury prevention program. But for some reason, we don't view prevention that way. We view prevention as something that has to be sold as an entire package, and it must be given to us. We can't mix and match and a la carte and be a cafeteria prevention expert where you can just choose what you want. I think that's the challenge in injury prevention programming is the change in mindset. Because we simply don't have all of the data that we need. We don't have large-scale studies, comparative methodology studies needed to give us a single prevention program that's good for this, or a single prevention program that's good for this, which is superior to the other one. And I think hopefully that is changing with Caroline Finch's article, and we've read it a couple times, the TRIP model. But you have to remember that only came out in 2011. It's only been 6 years, which if we think about the time it takes for dissemination to happen and then the time it takes to adopt new models, we're just beginning to scratch the surface. Probably just Caroline Finch and her group is doing that methodology. It's probably not moved out of Australia. You might have some sprinkles here and there of people trying to do it here in the United States, but a lot of the people who have made their names on injury prevention programming in the profession have done it with a certain methodology. And it doesn't make sense for them at that point in their career to change their methodology to match someone else's paradigm. It's not beneficial for them. So it's going to be a period of time, a long period of time, 15, 20 years, before we are really getting at this idea where injury prevention program A is superior to injury prevention program B for the prevention of ACL tears in boys and girls, men and women, ages 16 to 25 who play all sports. That's much different than the type of prevention that we talk about from a public health level. Something like wearing a seatbelt, or something like drinking and driving. But those are injury prevention programs. Wearing life vests. Those are injury prevention programs. But those are not sports injury prevention programs. And so a massive effort is not being undertaken to do that. And so we have couple decades before we're going to be able to just pull out our sheet of paper and say, this is what we need to do. But when we implement these things, we have to have a methodology, whatever works for us. We have to have a plan to measure that. And we need to understand the limitations of the plan that we're picking, or the framework that we're using. It doesn't have to be a plan. You just have to have a framework. And as athletic trainers, we should be able to break down a pre-made injury prevention program to its base components. Just like you break down a journal article to its base components. There may be words. You could be talking about cancer cells, or you could be talking about ACL tears, and you can pretty much read the article from a component analysis perspective and say, they're introducing the problem here, they're discussing previous research here, they're talking about the gaps in the literature here, they're talking about how they can fill in their new work here. In injury prevention, we can say, okay, they're using this as a warm-up, they're using this for flexibility purposes, increasing range of motion, we're using this for muscular strength, we're using the whole program for cardiorespiratory endurance. We're using this for balance and proprioception. We're using this for agility and plyometrics. As athletic trainers, we should have the knowledge and the skill to do that. But it's how we approach this. But we don't think about how we approach our clinical practice as much, and it's not as apparent as it is with something like when we did ATTR 712. The 10 steps to reading a journal article. There are discrete steps into deciphering an injury prevention program. And part of that comes from practice. And no two injury prevention programs look the same. So our activity this week is going to focus on breaking those things down and then talking about them in groups. So that's our plan for the week. And I know this was kind of this was the lecture. This is if you're watching this now, you obviously know this was not the weekly update. This was the lecture for the week that I usually do on a PowerPoint. But how do I put what I said into a PowerPoint besides just copying exactly what I said? So that's the nuts and bolts of injury prevention programming. That's the nuts and bolts of how to implement a program. It's not about, there's no secret recipe. There's no secret step. The secret is understanding that there is no secret. The secret is understanding that you need to create a culture of prevention. The secret is that you need to understand your stakeholders. The secret is that you need to use all of the pieces of evidence-based practice. The secret is that you need to measure what you're doing and then share that information. The secret is use your knowledge to your advantage. The secret is not to accept things the way they are, because the factors by which we create injury prevention programs are so narrow. That set of circumstances are so narrow that it's not going to apply to most of us, ever. But we need to do something in the present to fix that problem, because waiting 2 decades for studies of that high of quality to come out like drug studies that we have right now is going to take time and millions and if not billions of dollars. But what happens when things cost money to do? They're going to be commercialized. You're going to have to pay for the FIFA 11 Plus. You're going to have to pay for the Peak C. You have to pay for all these things. Maybe in the future insurance will pay for injury prevention programming. I don't know. But if we want that increased quality, it's going to cost money. So in the meantime, we have to have something to keep our patients in good health. And hopefully through the activities this week, hopefully through some reflection, we can get there and talk about that using the things we've used in the past in this class so far. I hope I didn't disappoint any of you, but if I did disappoint you, let me know. Be happy to talk about it, because yeah, I'd like to hear what you have to think about this as well. If I did disappoint you, because it may be deflating, but it may not. Hopefully, it's not disappointing, because that's the state of the literature as it stands today. So specific programs exist. Are they transferable beyond the study themselves? 99% of them are not. And the ones that are still very limited. So with that, I'm going to end this. And if you have any questions, please let me know. Have a great week.